Morning, everybody. I'm back. It's 7 o'clock. You are very welcome to join us on The Breakfast Show here on Sky News. Start of a big week for Boris Johnson as he prepares to face the MPs who could decide his political future. Later on today, we're expecting a dossier of his Partygate defence to be published as he tries to convince MPs he didn't knowingly or recklessly mislead Parliament. Plus, China's president heads to Moscow after an arrest warrant is issued for President Putin over alleged war crimes in Ukraine. We'll be joined by a former International Criminal Court prosecutor. And later, we'll be joined by Donald Trump's former national advisor. That's John Bolton. It's Monday, the 20th of March. Make or break Boris Johnson's Partygate defence to be published later. His team insists he'll be vindicated. Chinese president heads to Moscow just days after the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin. War crimes are top of the agenda as the UK hosts a summit to help track down those guilty of war crime atrocities. Investors watch anxiously to see if the rescue of Credit Suisse will steady stock markets around the world. The campaign to ban trophy hunting, the argument rages over how successful the UK's new law will be in protecting wildlife. Good morning, everybody. Boris Johnson's political future could hang in the balance this week as he tries to convince MPs that he didn't mislead Parliament over Partygate. His defence against those claims is expected to be published later on today before he gives evidence to the Privileges Committee on Wednesday. That's going to be box office, isn't it? You can watch it, of course, here on Sky. His team insists the evidence will show he didn't knowingly mislead MPs. We know from official reports that there were at least 15 parties in Downing Street between May 2020 and April 2021. In December of 2021, Boris Johnson was repeatedly challenged on those parties and repeatedly told the House of Commons he knew nothing about them. An interim committee report published earlier this month said it should have been obvious to him that rules were being broken. His defence will be published today and is likely to include the advice he was given at the time. The Privileges Committee will cross-examine the former PM on Wednesday and decide whether he deliberately misled the House and, if so, whether he should be suspended. Any sanction will have to be approved by MPs in a vote. It could come down to whether or not they believe him when he told the Commons no rules were broken.
All guidance was followed completely during Number 10.
I have been repeatedly assured since these allegations emerged that there was no party and that no COVID rules were broken. I'm sickened myself and furious about that. But I repeat what I have said to him, that I've been repeatedly assured that the rules were not broken. The guidance was followed and the rules were followed at all times.
Well, let's find out more. Should be joining us now is our political correspondent, Tamara Cohen. Good morning. So when we saw those pictures of him having parties, he didn't think they were parties.
That's right. So Partygate is back, and today we'll see Boris Johnson's written defence of those parties, those pictures, ahead of his appearance in front of the committee, which should be quite fiery on Wednesday. So this is not about whether the parties happened, we know they did, or who brought the suitcases of wine. This is whether he misled Parliament, whether what he said at the time was what he really believed to be the case, whether he was recklessly misleading MPs. Now, his defence is expected, when we see it later today, it will be published by the committee, to do two things. We're expecting to see messages from some of his civil servants and advisors in Downing Street with some of the advice they gave him about those parties, which Boris Johnson's team say will bolster the idea that he was just doing what he was advised to do. I think we're also going to see him throwing out a few grenades at the committee and the whole process, which you will have seen his allies have called a kangaroo court and a witch hunt. They say that this committee, which of course has a majority of Conservatives on it, is out to get him. So he is going to be mounting this robust defence, and the reason is because the stakes are really high. If he's found to have lied to Parliament, that committee can recommend he be suspended from Parliament, and that could lead to a by-election in his constituency and him being kicked out by the voters there. So this is a really important moment, and that's why I think Boris Johnson's team will be fighting it very hard, and they say they believe that he will be vindicated.
OK, Tamara, for now, thanks very much indeed. Now's the chance for you to have your say on that big topic of the day. What should happen to Boris Johnson if he's found to have recklessly misled Parliament? Why don't you let us know your thoughts? You can tweet me directly if you would like to. What should happen to Boris Johnson if he's found to have recklessly misled Parliament? Tell us your thoughts and we will share it with the world on our breakfast show. Let us know. We've had lots of replies already. We will turn to some of those a little bit later on in the programme. Meantime, let's tell you about China's President Xi arriving in Moscow today, hoping to help settle what he calls the crisis in Ukraine. In an article published ahead of his meeting with Vladimir Putin, he said of him, "A friend in need is a friend indeed."
The importance of the visit this week really can't be overemphasised. A 3-day state visit where President Xi will travel to Moscow today. He'll have informal meetings and an informal dinner with President Putin tonight before more serious talks tomorrow. Now, look, the two leaders have met many times, but the stakes have felt higher. And the reason, of course, is the context of the war in Ukraine and, crucially, what China's position on that war is. Now, China has always said it is a neutral party in the conflict, that it wants to act as a peacemaker. It says it's one of the few countries in the world that has the authority to do that because it hasn't sold arms to either side. It says it hasn't taken sides. But, of course, the West would slightly raise an eyebrow to that because it says that China has been quietly supplying Russia with finance, with technology and all-important diplomatic cover as well. So certainly from President Xi's perspective, he will want to be seen to be gaining some ground as part of this meeting. And what exactly that looks like is very uncertain at the moment. But be in no doubt, the relationship between China and Russia is very, very important to the Chinese as well. It is countries that do a lot of trade with each other. They share a long border that's very important to both sides to keep peaceful. And certainly from the Chinese perspective as well, Russia offers a like-minded ally in an increasingly difficult power struggle with the West. And that is very, very important as well. So what breakthroughs, if any, come out of this remain to be seen. But it is a very, very significant gesture that President Xi is choosing to go on the very week that President Putin has not only been issued with an arrest warrant from the International Criminal Court, but is also pictured walking around occupied Mariupol. A very big gesture and a very important meeting indeed.
And more from Helen Ann in the next hour. Justice ministers from around the world will meet in London today to pledge help for the International Criminal Court in its investigations into war crimes. On Friday, the court issued an arrest warrant against Russia's President Putin, accusing him of personal responsibility for the removal of children from Ukraine to Russia. Ivor has more for us this morning. Good morning, Ivor. Tell me more.
Morning, Kay. Yes, so this meeting has actually been in the diary for a few months now. Primarily, it was set up as a way to garner more practical support for the court, support in the form of money, personnel and expertise. And to that end, the UK has already pledged it'll give more than £1 million to the court this year, and other countries are expected to follow suit, dig a bit deeper into their pockets. But secondly, in the wake of that arrest warrant being issued on Friday for Vladimir Putin, this is going to provide a very visual show of support for the court and for that arrest warrant. It's a demonstration that the international community supporting Ukraine is also supporting the ICC, a very direct counterpoint to Xi's visit to Moscow that we've just been hearing about, and saying to everyone, look, OK, Russia might have China, but look who we've got. More than 40 nations will be represented at this meeting. They'll be hosted by Dominic Raab, the UK's Justice Secretary, and also his Dutch counterpart at Lancaster House in central London. We'll get a press conference at 5:30 where we hear what's been decided. I'm not sure it makes it any more likely that Russia's president will be going on trial anytime soon, but what this does do is isolate him even more and also shore up support for Ukraine. OK, for now.
Ivor, thank you. Well, joining us now is Sir Geoffrey Nice, who led the prosecution against the former Yugoslavian president, Slobodan Milosevic. Hello to you, Sir Geoffrey. Thank you for joining us on the programme this morning. It's always great to see you.
Morning.
What does this arrest warrant actually mean?
Labels Putin as a wanted criminal. The label will stick with him for his life unless either he's tried and acquitted or, almost inconceivable, the International Criminal Court withdraws the arrest warrant. And as a man labelled as a criminal in that way, he can't travel to any of the countries that are signed up to the ICC or probably to many other countries like America either. And he's going to have to live with that until it's resolved.
But you point out there countries that are signed up to the ICC. Not all of them are, not least China, meeting with Xi Jinping later on today. So in reality, what impact might it have on his day-to-day life?
Well, just what I've said, he can't travel to the other countries. It may also, of course, mean that any powers in Moscow that want to see him toppled, and we sometimes hear that there are some, will feel emboldened. His own people may not want to be led by a man who is labelled as a war criminal. But for the time being, those are the only immediate and obvious concerns. But it's a very, very important and very welcome move that the ICC has made.
How important is it that other countries get involved with the arrest warrant?
Well, it is, of course, very important that the ICC, which has been, I'm afraid, a much criticised court, has eventually brought out this warrant. We were rather concerned that maybe it was delaying action in order to not to impede peace moves. But in any case, it's brought the warrant out, so better late than never. And it's very important that support is given for the ICC. 2 points I'd like to make. One, it might be thought helpful for the international community to join Ukrainian parliamentarians who seek to relieve Russia of its powers of veto in the Security Council by suspending it in the way that, for example, South Africa was suspended for 20 years from operating in the UN. And if that were to happen, it would be possible to get the crime of aggression, or more possible, get the crime of aggression within the jurisdiction of the ICC. And that would be extremely welcome because many people regard that as the most appropriate crime to be tried. Second thing is the presence of internationals is good, but not necessarily always and absolutely good. And it's a very good thing that Mr. Raab is chairing this meeting because he has direct knowledge, going back 19 years now, of how once internationals get involved in international justice, they can apply quite improper pressure on those who are trying to operate a judicial machine. Because this is an example, but 19 years ago, when I was seeking to get the very best possible evidence, as I imagined it to be, against Milosevic for his role in Srebrenica, these were intercepts of phone calls that we knew had been made between him and Mladic. For reasons that are still not entirely clear, parts of the international community stepped in and simply stopped the investigation. And they stopped it because they had interests of their own to serve, reputational interests or security interests. We have no idea. We had no idea at the time, and we have little more idea now. And it would be quite unreasonable to think that simply having internationals involved in the court or even in supporting the court is going to make that court a cleaner court than it otherwise would be. So yes, it's great that they're supporting the court with money and making it possible for Mr. Khan to do more work and do his work even better than he may have done it already. But don't fall into the trap of thinking that internationalizing criminal process is going to make it better or cleaner, because it won't. And the experience I had 19 years ago, of which Mr. Raab will be aware, is a real warning sign. And the truth that I was seeking to establish then, and have never been able to establish then or since, led to certain inferences being drawn in a sort of casual way by the team at the time. And those inferences have been strengthened since by other material that has come to light, making it even more important that I was never interfered with in the investigations that I sought to make. So that's a good point. By the way, it also, the caution with which one must look at both the International Criminal Court, which has itself been accused in respect of other matters of being perhaps partial or subject to international influence, and the point I've just made, can reinforce a general observation that the most appropriate setting for trials of war crimes in this war is Ukraine itself, and for war crimes accountability processes to be conducted by Ukrainians and in the Ukrainian and Russian languages. People sometimes think that's a surprising proposition to make, but it's not. It's completely obvious. if crimes are committed on your territory, it's your sovereign right and duty, you might argue, to deal with them. And if America and Canada found themselves in conflict over a seizure by Canada of part of Alaska, or if England was separated from Scotland and there was a war and war crimes were alleged, that sort of hypothetical example, do you think any of those countries would allocate responsibility for dealing with war crimes to France or Morocco or New Zealand or somewhere? Of course they wouldn't. They try them themselves. And so the basic premise is Ukraine first. Second, let's help the International Criminal Court. But third, don't assume that letting internationals get involved will make it a cleaner court or a better court, because it will still possibly be vulnerable to international pressure. And as Mr. Raab knows from his own experience, that's dangerous.
We must leave it there, Sir Geoffrey, but absolutely fascinating stuff, as always. Thank you for taking the time. Thank you.
You're most welcome.
Still to come on the programme for you this Monday morning as the UK hosts a meeting to discuss potential war crimes in Ukraine. Just talking about that. Speaking to former UK NATO representative Lord Ricketts very shortly. Shortly after that, be speaking to Dominic Grieve, former Attorney General and also former Conservative MP, as Boris Johnson sets out his Partygate defence dossier. We'll also be joined by the Shadow Minister for Health and Social Care, that's Liz Kendall, just after 8 o'clock. Before all of that, though, let me tell you about the Swiss bank UBS. It's rescued the beleaguered Credit Suisse in a multi-billion-pound deal. Failing to act according to the Swiss president would have had unthinkable consequences for global financial markets. Let's get more, should we? Ian standing by for us in the city. So they bailed him out, Ian. Good morning.
Hello, Kay. Yes, this is an absolutely monumental deal. It's like sort of the banking equivalent in Switzerland of Liverpool and Manchester United merging. These are the two big giants of the Swiss banking sector. It means effectively Switzerland now has one big global bank. Now, there are going to be consequences of this for quite some time, not least the fact that Credit Suisse employs more than 5,000 people here in London. Most of them work in the investment banking side of the business. And Colin Kelleher, the chairman of UBS, said last night that that part of the business would certainly be de-emphasised because UBS regards itself as a considerably less risky business than Credit Suisse. So I think there will undoubtedly be job losses here in London. That's the first point. Secondly, it's all about the market reaction now. Now, overnight in the Asia-Pacific region, you've seen banking shares selling off, two of which are quoted here in London, Standard Chartered and HSBC. Both of those have listings in Hong Kong, which have fallen by around 6 and 7%. All of the Asian stock markets have also fallen, incidentally. But I think it's what happens in the United States later on today that will also be pretty critical, because this has again shone the light, I think it will, on some of these mid-tier and regional American banks, the likes of First Republic, which we talked about in the past. Essentially, the Swiss government had to step in to rescue Credit Suisse, or oversee this rescue, because there was a loss of confidence. Credit Suisse was losing deposits. People were taking the money out of the bank. And this, of course, remember, is one of the world's 50 biggest banks. It's a systemically important bank. So I think there'll be concerns in the United States about the status of some of these mid-tier US banks. In the meantime, there are all sorts of ramifications for bondholders, because a class of bondholders in Credit Suisse have been completely wiped out, whereas shareholders will be getting something for their money. This is a very, very unusual state of affairs. So I suspect you will see some forms, some classes of banking bonds falling very sharply when the markets open this morning as well. And I should say, by the way, in the pre-market trade, shares of UBS are down some 7%. Shares of Credit Suisse are down 61% right now.
Wow. Ian, it's good to get your expertise on that. Thank you. Ian King live, of course, 10 o'clock this morning here on Sky News. Meantime, in other news, 70,000 university staff are striking again today as part of a 3-day walkout over pay and pensions. University and college union members from 150 different universities rejected the latest offer for a pay increase. It's not just university staff. Let's take a look at other strikes expected in the coming weeks. Driving test examiners have multiple strike days planned this week and next. There you go. Further rail strikes are planned for the end of the month. Security guards at Heathrow will strike for 10 days over Easter. Great. Starting at the end of this month and into next month. And passport office staff will strike for 5 weeks from the 3rd of April. Talk about that later on in the week, actually, and the impact it might have on you if you are planning or your passport's run out and you need a new passport. 5 weeks of strikes at the passport office. Yeah, really. Looking at some of today's other headlines for you now. Hundreds of people arrested across France over the weekend as protests intensified against President Emmanuel Macron's move to bypass Parliament and raise the country's retirement age. The French president used a special constitutional power to push through a plan to raise the retirement age by 2 years to 64 without a parliamentary vote. As a result, he now faces a no-confidence vote later on today. A murder investigation has been launched after a 17-year-old boy was stabbed to death at a house party in Leeds. West Yorkshire police were called to the party in the early hours of Sunday morning, where the teenager was found and taken to hospital. He was pronounced dead at the hospital. The government's food czar has quit in order to freely criticise what he called insane inaction against obesity. Henry Dimbleby, the co-founder of the food chain Leon, said ministers were to blame for 2/3 of UK adults being overweight or obese because they refused to impose restrictions on the junk food industry. A new report suggests that there's a global shortage of nurses. The International Council of Nurses says the situation should be treated as a global health emergency. The report also says that 40 to 80% of nurses experience mental health and psychological distress. 20 years on since the beginning of the 2003 Iraq War, the Defence Secretary is due to visit the National Memorial Arboretum in Staffordshire to lay a wreath at the Basra Memorial Wall. It's in memory of the 179 personnel who lost their lives in Iraq. A major report on climate change is being released later on today. It's expected to call for emission targets to be brought forward, or the world will face a climate catastrophe. It'll be the 6th assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and it could be its most bleak yet. It's feared that in parts of the world it'll be too hot to live and work in the decades ahead. We will have more on that later in the programme, joined by Mary Robinson, Chair of the Elders and the former UN Special Envoy for Climate Change. Russia is being accused of stoking protests, spreading propaganda and backing an alleged coup in Moldova. Vladimir Putin has been accused of deliberately destabilising the country as he seeks to create a land bridge between southern Ukraine and the former Soviet Republic. Our Europe correspondent Siobhan Robbins is in the Moldovan capital of Chisinau and sent this report on the invisible war being waged on Ukraine's neighbours.
Down with the dictator, they shout. For months, rising food and energy costs has brought protesters onto Moldova's streets. But the government's accused Russia of deliberately stoking the anger by pushing up prices, spreading propaganda and backing a plot to overthrow them. Something Moscow and Moldova's pro-Russian politicians dispute.
We are supporting the protests because the life in our country became too difficult. We, as the parliamentary faction and the parliamentary party, we don't feel this interference.
Moldova's pro-Western president says they're fighting a hybrid war under attack from Kremlin interference as it tries to destabilize Ukraine's neighbors. Here's an example of growing Russian interference. This is an old video of a military parade in Romania, but it quickly became an alarmist social media post shared by pro-Russians in Moldova with warnings the tanks were heading for their border. Monitoring group Watchdog MD claims Russian disinformation has rocketed tenfold in the last year.
We are feeling the pressure even from here, from Chisinau. So basically what I would say is the future of the country, not to be too pathetic about it, lies at stake.
But public opinion is divided. In the pro-Russian autonomous region of Gagauzia, Many feel closer to Moscow than the West. At the market, no one I speak to believes Russia is a threat. Like Valentina, they fondly remember their Soviet past.
The government says that Russia is trying to stir up trouble and interfere in politics here. Do you believe that?
Нет.
Do you trust President Putin?
We believe in everyone, she says. If a person is attacked, he has to defend his people. But it's not Russian troops Moldova has to fight. The enemy here is invisible. The battlefield, largely online. Siobhan Robbins, Sky News, Moldova.
Let's have a look at what the papers are saying this morning. Should we? The Metro leading on Boris Johnson's claim he has a 50-page dossier that will clear him of any wrongdoing over Partygate. That story is also on the front of the Eye. It says Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has postponed the announcement of several key policies because of the publication of the documents. The Times says an independent report due to be released tomorrow will reveal that the Met Police force faces being broken up if it does not rapidly overhaul its toxic culture. The FT has the news that UBS has agreed to buy Credit Suisse for $3.25 billion, which is £2.5 billion in English money, as regulators attempt to prevent the collapse of the Swiss banking system. And finally, the Daily Telegraph also leads on that story. It warns that thousands of jobs in the City of London could go because of the merger. It's a lot warmer this morning where we are here in London. What about where you are?
Warm memories wherever you go. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
This week looks mild and unsettled, but temperatures will return to near average later on, perhaps cold in the north by the weekend. Now, remember that picture we showed you before the break? It's a huge World War II mine which has been detonated off the coast of Croatia. Local authorities first discovered the 1,500-pound explosive back in June. However, in a hugely risky operation, it had to be moved further away from the city of Rijeka before emergency teams performed the controlled detonation. Our top stories for you this morning. Make or break. Boris Johnson's Partygate defence is to be published later on today. His team insists he'll be vindicated. Chinese president heads to Moscow to meet Vladimir Putin just days after the International Criminal Court issued an arrest warrant for the Russian president. The UK will host a war crimes meeting later on today following accusations that the Russian president is involved in the abduction of Ukrainian children. Well, that's a story that we want to talk about in more detail. Lord Peter Ricketts was the UK's permanent representative to NATO and a former permanent Under-Secretary at the Foreign Office. He's with us this morning. Good morning. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning.
So, there's a warrant for his arrest. What difference will that make?
Nothing at all to Xi Jinping, who doesn't recognise the International Criminal Court and is very happy with the way things are, I think, with Russia. Suits China very well. So he will continue with his visit as if that didn't exist.
What about for President Putin? What difference does it make to him?
Well, in his normal life, nothing at all, I don't think, because he's not about to leave Russia, certainly not to go to any country that might possibly take action on this arrest warrant. But it still sends a very strong signal that the head of a major country is now under an arrest warrant for war crimes. And around the world, that sends a pretty strong signal that we do not accept there's any impunity for the kind of behaviour that we've seen from Russian forces under Putin's control. I don't think we'll see him in The Hague in the International Criminal Court, honestly, anytime soon.
Could it, though, potentially provoke him and therefore prolong the war?
I don't think so. I mean, he's already in real trouble in the war. I think the visit by Xi Jinping is very helpful to him. It bolsters him. It shows him he's got an important ally in the world. But I think he's got to now prosecute this war crime warrant or not. I think it's more important the signal it sends outside Russia to other countries who might be thinking of supporting Putin.
What did you make of his visit at the weekend to Mariupol?
Symbolic.
And Crimea as well, of course.
And Crimea as well. Symbolic. I mean, mainly a signal back into Russia that he is capable of travelling. And that he's taking some credit for having taken the city of Mariupol. In many ways, it was pretty laughable, really. I mean, he had to go in the dead of night nobody around, driving around deserted streets. You couldn't see the extent of the damage and desolation in Mariupol. So, I mean, it was a pretty empty propaganda exercise, I think, which won't have convinced very many people outside Russia.
But it was for a domestic audience, I'm guessing.
I think it was for a domestic audience, and it was to show the Russians that, you know, he has got something out of this awful, devastating war. He can at least go, you know, when nobody is around, to this smashed-up city of Mariupol.
You started off by talking about the Chinese president, as we look at these images now. How concerned does the West need to be about China cozying up to Russia?
I think it's a fact that Russia and China both see themselves as in a confrontation with the West. And for the Chinese, it's very convenient, this war. I don't think they're about to do anything particular to bring it to an end. It makes Russia weak and dependent on China, gives them access to massive amounts of Russian oil and gas, and it distracts America from confrontation with China because it involves them in supporting Ukraine in Europe. So I think the status quo serves Xi Jinping just fine.
And what's your view? I mean, because it depends who sits there. Two schools of thought when it comes to China getting involved in the war in Ukraine with Russia and what the West might thus do about it. Either China won't because they need to sell their goods to people like us and the Americans and the Europeans, or actually China doesn't care because they have a ready market in East Africa that is developing all the time.
China will decide what to do in the basis of Chinese interests.
Yep.
And I think Chinese interests are to keep Russia weak, a kind of vassal state, and cheap energy available, but also not to burn their bridges with Europe or even America. As you say, they have enormous trading interests and they have an awful lot of dollar deposits in Washington. So I don't think they want to get completely on one side of the line or the other. Therefore, I don't think they're going to go all in to support Putin. Personally, I don't see them supplying major weapons systems.
You don't?
Partly because I don't think they would want them to fall into Ukrainian hands on the battlefield and then get to America. So they might provide, you know, some munitions or something, but I think it'll be fairly low level. More important, economic support, technological support, yes. So the relationship with Russia is strong. That means that their peace proposals are simply diplomatic wallpaper. Frankly, they're not in any position to broker a peace deal. But I don't think that they're going to burn their boats completely with Europe and the West. They've got President Macron of France going on a state visit in a few days' time. They will want to keep playing everyone to Chinese interests.
It's 20 years since the Iraq war. Can you believe it? How do you think we should look back at that?
Well, I believe it was, in a way, the pivotal event in international affairs since the end of the Cold War. Why? Because after a decade in which we'd used our armed forces under Blair for humanitarian good in places like Kosovo and Bosnia, and even in northern Iraq in 1991, suddenly US and UK went into a war without UN authority. I think that both knocked confidence in the West at ever intervening again in other people's affairs. It empowered the authoritarians, and I'm afraid it left us in the non-aligned countries looking hypocritical. Because now when we come to say, will you back us against Russia on Ukraine, they say, but you invaded Iraq 20 years ago. So I think we can still see the impacts of that devastating decision today.
It's interesting to... I wonder what our viewers think this morning, how they remember the Iraq war. I know that some of our leaders are heading up to the Arboretum later on today to pay their respects to those lives that were lost. Depends who you talk to. Quite a lot of people that I speak to think that it was a pointless war.
I mean, at the time, and I was in the Foreign Office
I know,
at the time,
that's why I'm asking you.
Blair was absolutely convinced that after 9/11, the risk that weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons or nuclear material could get into the hands of terrorists might prove an even worse attack than 9/11. And he and George Bush were convinced that there might somehow be a way in which the weapons of mass destruction they thought were in Iraq could get into the hands of terrorists. That's why I think Blair went to war. You know, he honestly believed it at the time, but we weren't prepared for the follow-up. We did a bad job of the occupation that we found ourselves in, and the region is more violent, more destabilised, more people have lost their lives as a result of the war. So
but we were led to believe, though, weren't we, that Britain or British soil could be impacted within 40 minutes?
Yes, and that was part of the intelligence that turned out to be dud intelligence. And so that is part of the reason people are quite rightly angry. I think people genuinely believed it at the time. There was an awful lot of this intelligence around. It turned out to be wrong. and therefore the whole basis of the war was wrong. The fact we didn't get UN authority put us in the, on the wrong side of the line internationally, and in a way we've been paying the price ever since.
We certainly have. Quick thought, perhaps on Boris Johnson?
Well, I mean...
That was a big sigh.
With all these things going on in the world that we've just talked about, it's a very dangerous, violent world out there. We've got a war crimes conference in London today. To me, this Boris Johnson stuff is really a distraction. He's no longer Prime Minister. Yeah, of course, the Parliament's got to decide, what his future is going to be. But he is not the top story, as far as I'm concerned. This international situation is far more important for the country.
Good to see you, as always. Thank you very much indeed for joining us on the programme. Thank you. Let us know your thoughts on that, or indeed any of the stories that we are covering here on the programme this morning. Like this one, perhaps, the family of one of India's most popular Punjabi hip-hop artists who was murdered last May have demanded justice as thousands of people paid their respects at a memorial service. Sidhu Moosewala was shot dead the day after his security team was publicly withdrawn by India's new government. From Mansa in Punjab, our correspondent Neville Lazarus reports.
His popularity remains unrivaled, with an ever-increasing fan base even after death. Thousands have come to pay tribute to Sidhu Moosewala. His songs and videos transcend borders and are watched hundreds of millions of times. Sidhu's killing has been controversial. Rich, famous, he dabbled in politics and fought elections. A marked man, he was provided state security. But the new government publicly announced it would be withdrawn. The family says it left him exposed. A day later, his killers followed him and gunned him down.
The authorities say the killing of Sidhu Moosewala was a result of gang rivalry and revenge. 27 persons, including the 6 gunmen, are in jail. The case is ongoing, but the family is unsatisfied with its pace and investigations.
His father is campaigning for justice for his son and has the support of the people.
We have got the person who fired that gun, but who are the people behind it? His father is literally saying, "Can you investigate those people?"
Sandy Joya, his childhood friend, has come from Kent. Sidhu often stayed with him when in Britain.
In fact, you can see all around the world as well. In the UK Parliament, as you know, that they raised this issue because he had the residence permit for UK. The Indian government, he was paying tax here. So this government, they're not doing anything.
Punjabi hip-hop has become popular with millions around the globe, and Sidhu its ambassador. Many of Sidhu's songs have been about weapons, revenge and gangs, where songs of guns and violence begin to imitate the lives they lead. Neville Lazarus, Sky News in Mansa, Punjab.
Now, you've probably heard of off-street parking, haven't you? Not like this, you haven't. Diners at Bath's Francis Hotel in Queen Square were treated with this sight on Mother's Day when a car became wedged against the hotel basement windows. Avon Fire and Rescue Service said crew freed one of the occupants from the vehicle while another was able to get out by himself. How did they get in that position? The car remains stuck, but the hotel is open as normal. They'll be able to cut that out, won't they? Probably. Now, whose birthday is it today? You've got a short break to have a think. Here's a clue. She starred in broadcast news and The Piano. She's a great actress. Stay tuned. Hello again, everybody. Before the break, we gave you a clue about whose birthday it is today. She starred in films Broadcast News, sensational movie. If you haven't seen it, you should. And The Piano, great in that as well. Did you guess it? It's Holly Hunter. She plays Jane Craig in Broadcast News and Ada McGrath in The Piano, along with many other movies as well. She's 65 today. She looks amazing, doesn't she? Happy birthday, Holly. Now, a little earlier, we asked you what should happen to Boris Johnson if he's found to have recklessly misled Parliament, and we suggested that you could probably let us know via our Twitter feed. So many of you have already. KS saying he should be suspended for 30 days, face a recall petition and then a by-election. If the Tories let him get away with this, it'll show they hold Parliament and the public in contempt. And Mary Scott also tweeted us this morning. Good morning, Mary. Thank you. Johnson should be suspended and barred from holding a seat as an MP ever again. His Lord's list should be revoked and he should pay back all costs for his legal case. I just checked that. It's presently £220,000 of your taxpayer money being used. And also Catherine Harrison. Catherine, good morning. Thanks for letting us know your thoughts. If he received a fixed penalty notice for something that he said quite adamantly in Parliament never happened, Johnson should be suspended, says Rich Turner, unseated and barred from standing again if there is a legal mechanism for doing so. Let us know your thoughts on that. You can tweet me directly if you would like to, at Kay Burley. Excuse me, we have a topic for you every single day. Today it is what should happen to Boris Johnson if he is found to recklessly have misled Parliament. I wonder what Dominic Grieve thinks about that, former Attorney General. Hello to you, Mr Grieve. Thanks for joining us on the programme this morning. What should happen to Mr Johnson?
Well, Mr Johnson's explanations have got to be considered by the committee. And they've got to do that in an impartial way, and I'm quite sure they're capable of doing it. They're a cross-party committee. And they've got to consider whether, in fact, the statements he made to the House of Commons were untrue. Mr Johnson certainly does appear to have a considerable problem. He attended some of the gatherings which were parties, and yet he said that there weren't any gatherings. And it's a bit difficult, therefore, to understand how he didn't know that there had been parties going on at number 10 Downing Street. He says they're work events. Well, the photograph you're just showing rather shows for itself the nature of the gatherings which were taking place. They don't look like work events. So Mr Johnson's got a lot of explaining to do. And of course, that is against the background of somebody who has a serial reputation for telling untruths whenever it suits him.
Well, he says that he has a 50-page written document that he's going to submit today. His lawyers have been working with him, and he will be able to prove that he did not mislead Parliament. Is there a difference between misleading Parliament and an intention to mislead Parliament?
It's possible for a minister or indeed a member of the House of Commons to inadvertently mislead Parliament. And if you do that, you should correct the inadvertent mistake you made at the earliest opportunity. It has been quite notable with Mr Johnson that he and his ministers have often misled Parliament on other matters and never corrected the record. But this is a particularly serious matter because it went right to the heart of his government. But yes, it is possible that the committee could conclude that although he misled the House of Commons, he didn't do it on purpose and that he was himself of the view that there weren't parties taking place at number 10 Downing Street. But as I say, the photographs will seem to me to demand some explanation as to how he could make those assertions when he was both attending events of the kind that you can see in the photographs, and on top of that, there are some internal emails in which he states this is the most unsocially distanced gathering that has taken place. So on the face of it, he seems to have known that there were gatherings which were taking place, which appear to have been in breach of the lockdown rules.
You are no fan of Boris Johnson, it has to be said. You've said he wasn't suitable to be Prime Minister and that he was taking the country down a dangerous path. A lot of your colleagues don't necessarily agree. He is still incredibly popular with the Conservative Party, and the growing view is that it would take somebody of his character to try to lead the Conservatives going forward if you lose the next election.
Well, I'm afraid that just shows that elements of the Conservative Party are still delusional about Mr Johnson. And if they want to continue along that path, it's a matter for them. But Mr Johnson is not going to help the Conservative Party's electoral fortunes. As for his future, I've no idea. The committee has got to act impartially. And as Parliament is not subject to any higher authority, because we have this thing called parliamentary sovereignty, and there's a privilege of Parliament, so no court can investigate what goes on there, it is self-regulating. So Mr Johnson, I'm afraid, can't complain about the fact that it is going to be a group of MPs who are going to consider the material on Wednesday and listen to what he has to say. And they will have to do their best to set aside all personal prejudices and just look rationally at what Mr. Johnson says when he says that he didn't mislead Parliament and look at the evidence, and they've got to come to a fair conclusion. And I'm quite sure that they're capable of doing that.
You mentioned the Privileges Committee. The chairman recused himself, stepped back because he had previously criticised the then Prime Minister, Chris Bryant, of course. It is majority Conservative, 4-3 of those who are on the committee. I want to ask you about Sue Gray, if I may, and the fact that she was apparently advising the committee while she was speaking to the opposition about a new post working for Sir Keir Starmer. Perception is not good there, is it?
I think that Sue Gray made, it's difficult to say an error. Let's take it two ways. Is it wrong for a former civil servant to go and work for a political party? No, it is not. And do I think that Sue Gray is, as a consequence of doing this shift, in some way tainted in her approach to being a civil servant in the years before? And I have to say, having known her for many years, when she's been a civil servant over the last 10 years or more, I'm absolutely satisfied about her impartiality and independence on every subject. So from that point of view, the shift that she has decided to make to becoming Keir Starmer's chief of staff is one which, in my view, is perfectly acceptable. The timing, one has to say, did come across as rather unfortunate in all the circumstances, but that's a matter of presentation. I don't happen to think that Sue Gray is in any way biased, or that her bias was present at all when she was a civil servant in Downing Street and Whitehall.
I understand that, Mr. Grieve, but perception is reality, and she put together a report which eventually brought down the then Prime Minister. She was advising a committee which is looking into the actions of the then Prime Minister and is at the same time talking to the opposition.
But she did the time she did her report, I'm not aware that at that stage she was talking to Keir Starmer about becoming his chief of staff at all.
No, but
I don't think there's any evidence of that whatsoever.
But she was when she was talking to the committee.
Well, she may have been when she was talking to the committee, but she wasn't when she did her report. And ultimately, it's her report which certainly helped bring the Prime Minister down. But you only have to look at the content of the report to see it would be very difficult for the report to say anything else, because it was backed up by a huge amount of evidence.
Quick thought before I let you go on the situation as far as the Home Secretary is concerned and Rwanda. What do you see happening? She says that she'll be sending people to Rwanda by the summer.
I shall wait with interest to see how many people actually get sent to Rwanda by the Home Secretary. I think it's a policy which is fraught with difficulty, and it will be interesting to see whether this policy actually works or not.
It's always great to see you. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Thank you. Coming up, we are going to be talking about Boris Johnson again. He is making headlines yet again. Today, we're asking you what should happen if he's been found to recklessly mislead Parliament. Paolo saying, when I was a UK civil servant, we were told in no uncertain terms that misleading Parliament was a crime punishable accordingly. Therefore, you would expect ministers to be under a stricter requirement than civil servants, at the very least the same. That's what Paolo says. What do you think? Do let us know. What should happen to Boris Johnson if he's found to have recklessly misled Parliament? We're going to be hearing his defence later on today, and then box office, 2 o'clock, Wednesday afternoon. He'll be giving his evidence live to the committee. You can watch it here on Sky. See you in a sec.